Welcome to this presentation. I'm Philip Pearce from James Cook University, Australia, and it's my pleasure to provide a few notes and a few thoughts for colleagues in Vienna about the topic of emotions. So I've entitled it, as you can see, Laughing, Crying or Lying, Insights into the Tourism Research on Emotions Through Discourse Analysis. And I take this opportunity to thank my colleagues in Griffith University as well as my own colleagues at James Cook University for assistance in putting this time together. I want to start by making an observation about these kinds of commentaries. I think that if you're going to have some credibility in this space, you have to have what the gamblers call some skin in the game. That is, you have to be doing some related work to be a reasonably credible observer. And I have been conducting with students and colleagues some work on topics of love, empathy and stress. And I'll just make a few comments about that work as an introduction to this presentation. The studies about love we've been doing in a couple of locations, dispersed locations. One at Juliet's Balcony in Verona, Italy, which is something of a pilgrimage site for those people that want to look at the topic of romantic love and possibly have some strong feelings when they visit that occasion with their partner or family. And then another site in Australia, which is the love story about the construction of a castle by a man for his wife, and he died ultimately in the whole process of building this monument to his partner. Now, what we've done in these particular studies is try and see how emotions work in the tourism space. And in the Italian situation, what we found essentially was that people's personal capital, their cultural capital, their understanding of the story and their participation with their partner gave many people a very strong affective or emotional experience of being at the site. If they had low cultural capital and they were impatient and frustrated by the situation in terms of the crowding, then they didn't have that experience and their satisfaction scores and their likelihood of recommending were very, very low. Similarly, if they got the love story, if they understood it and appreciated the situation in the Australian context, they worried a lot less about the expensive price, they worried a lot less about the physical decay of the building, provided they understood the love story. So those two studies began for me to reveal how important the affective and emotional reactions are in tourism sites. Similarly, we've looked at some related emotions that matter, how people react to poverty. And these studies were done in southern Africa, and what we did there was we reviewed a large number of travel blogs, and we found out that the kinds of reactions people had to the experience of seeing people in pretty dire circumstances varied from almost total indifference, almost not seeing them, through to an appreciation that I'd actually want to change my behaviour, that I felt deep empathy with the situation. So again, in a tourism situation, the emotional reaction to a particular kind of experience was shown to be strong and powerful and important. In the Japanese study about stress, which is about perceived stress, we asked people using some of the retro methodology techniques we've been developing, which are recrafting older methodologies essentially, to draw and sketch their perceived stress during a seven-day holiday. And we found some consistent patterns about women in particular in the first phase, the first 20% of the holiday, reported a lot more stress and, if you like, difficulties in managing their world and the world of those they were travelling with than the men were reporting. So these kinds of background studies that I've participated in terms of emotion, using a variety of techniques from very, very close observation of people in a field situation through to travel blogs and stories, through to some of the retro methodologies, I hope provide some skin in the game, some credibility of what I'm going to say in a general way about emotions. The distinguished co-discoverer of penicillin, a Nobel Prize-winning author, Lord Florey, who worked in the Oxford laboratories in chemistry for many, many years, had the habit of going around behind his graduate students and saying, "Tell me, what is the problem you're trying to solve?" And so I take that as a touchstone for this little presentation today. What's the problem we're trying to solve? What do I mean? What's the point here? And it is, for me, how we can offer insights, how I can offer some insights perhaps, into the diverse work being undertaken in tourism study, and with links to some other fields on this topic of emotions. So I'm hunting for insights. And the approach I've chosen to attack this challenge is to use the elements, the essentials of discourse analysis. And in looking at discourse analysis as an ambitious way to cover this demanding topic area, there's 3 steps that the discourse analysis people talk about. One is to focus on how the text is produced and disseminated, essentially what forms the information is delivered in. The second characteristic of discourse analysis is to look at the linguistic characteristics of the text itself. These are the wordings, the gaps, the terminology, dominant themes or principles. And finally, to get a whole and comprehensive approach to the topic area you're interested in, you need to consider social practice, which essentially are the institutional and economic power-based conditions under which the text or the material is produced. So let's go to the first one, which is how the text is produced. In the emotions space, there's been an explosion of journal publishing options. So it will come as no surprise to most of you who have done some work in this area. There's no absolute centre for emotion research in and beyond tourism study. Emotion studies cover the range of tourism journals, and they're full of opportunities for publishing in other fields as well. And in fact, some of the major journals in psychology and neuroscience feature many, many studies about emotion. So explosion of journal publishing, that's one form of dissemination. Interestingly, in this area, there are some other areas which matter as well. And there's been some key books and talks given about emotions, which I think are influential for academic life and analysis and for the work we want to do in tourism. So they range from Darwin's original work on the expression of emotions, through to some of the neuroscience work, through to Amy Cuddy's work from Harvard about presence and your physical appearance, Fredrickson's work on positivity, Peter Collett's work on human ethology, and so on. So there's something beyond the journals in this space, major books and public presentations, YouTube talks, and so on. There's also an important contribution about the study of emotions, which we have to deal with as researchers, from popular culture. So there are books written about emotions, there are stories, there are narratives, there are novels of various quality. Emotions are expressed in art and in artefacts in all sorts of ways. So popular culture is another form of dissemination, which makes us think about what does this do for our work in tourism? Well, the level of implication I want to draw out of this first discourse analysis point is that the highly prestigious outlets are more oriented towards biophysical measures and experimentation in controlled settings. So if you look at journal rankings, if you look at the prestige given to publication outputs, those that are ranked the most highly in all of the international ranking systems and citation scores and so on, tend to favour very much a biophysical approach to this topic. But more than that, this dissemination of the topic of emotions in popular culture means the researchers have to fight for their credibility in the wider public production about emotions. So people feel they know about this topic. They feel that they can assess what's going on when we do research on this topic. So we have to, if you like, recognise that people have their own benchmarks, they have their own standards for evaluating our work. And this matters as well, so that the way we communicate has to have some public credibility. Tracking the discourse analysis style of looking at this topic to a second level, we can focus on the text, what's actually said, the themes, the wording, the gaps. You might quickly say, what text? What did you look at? How did you actually assess such a diverse and complex field? Well, what I did was certainly moved outside of the papers that I've written as an author or co-author, and working with my PhD students and team of people, we did a little sampling here. We sampled 24 papers on emotions. each of my current 6 PhD students. Selected 4 each, somewhat at random, but structured in a small way. So 12 were drawn from tourism studies and 12 from other disciplinary sources, particularly psychology, psychiatry and neurosciences. And we summarise these papers in a systematic way under 3 headings: the definitions of emotions used in the studies, the methods used to measure this topic area, and the implications of the work. And what we are going to suggest, what I'm about to say, is that this text can be synthesised and looked at according to 6 key dimensions. The discourse, from the textual analysis work we have done, suggests that the scope of the work varies. Some studies of emotions use a broad definition of affect, and they include emotions and moods, and that definition of emotion embraces self-report, it embraces physical appearance and bodily movements, and it also embraces at the same time what's going on in terms of brain function. The other approach to emotions in some of the studies is that emotion is defined as particularly what you're measuring. A very specific facet only is considered. So this is going to take me to another point in a minute, but the problem we often have in this discourse about emotions is how broadly we are actually defining this whole topic area. Genesis of emotions is another theme and dimensional way of looking at the text, and there are some top-down input or appraisals where thinking is seen as the dominant mechanism through which emotions are realised, versus other approaches, particularly from the neuroscientists, and I cite in particular Panskip here, who talk about hardwired processing and the immediacy of emotions being triggered by stimuli. So there's a debate in the literature there between top-down input versus hardwired processing. That discourse links to another one, which is time as an element in our assessment of emotions. Quite important for tourism researchers. There's been an immediacy versus degrees of delay from a trigger event approach. So some of the recent work which colleagues around the world are trying to do is trying to look at the immediacy of the emotional reaction or experience, versus other people are looking at degrees of delay from the trigger event. So that takes us into short-term delay, maybe an hour after the event, maybe recollections a day or 2 days after the event. But I want to extend that a little bit more and also suggest that there's anticipation in an emotional sense. That is, thinking emotion in emotion-related terms about a holiday or an event you're going to have, and then also savouring, where savouring is defined as the long-term recollection and enjoyment with a rich emotional character to a tourism experience. So time and where we are measuring emotions and thinking about them in the timeline is an organising dimension. It's also a classification issue in the literature. Deriving from the human ethology work, particularly the facial work of Ekman, but before that there's other people involved as well, on a simple category basis for emotions, with some core emotions being recognised, which have physical dimensions or properties to them in terms of facial muscles, versus a much more I suppose, modulated approach where there's 2, 3-dimensional views of emotions, and the individually strong categories are seen as blending into one another with a variety of diversity or a diversity of options and possibilities. So that's another way that the literature, the text on emotions and research varies. There's also a measurement, diversity in the way people look at the emotions topic. Some orthodox approaches are to use one tool. That may be an online survey, it may be simple Likert scales, versus people who are trying to look at integrative measures. That is, look at some of the physical measures like skin conductivity, movement, positioning, heart rates and so on, and then also ally that to people's self-report and physical appearance issues. So measurement does seem to define the studies as one of the ways to think about the text. Finally, but not unimportantly, some of the studies seem to believe and argue that emotions have a direct and immediate effect on behaviour. Possibly. It's interesting that those people that do that seem to not be so convinced or not so reliant on the idea that emotions are a category of, if you like, psychological constructs where they can affect other, perhaps more generative ideas such as motivation and attitudes. So the way that emotions are seen as having power, or their implications, does also vary in the literature. The various linguistic devices which exist in the discourse analysis add a little to this dimensional appraisal. I'm going to pick on 5. There is, in discourse analysis, an interesting factor called repetition. How much an idea is repeated, how much it follows through from one study to the next, how many times people say the same thing. And we do have in the emotions research sometimes a repetition of older studies where they're taken as, if you like, very, very important and not really points about which one wants to argue. There may well be some problems with that. There may well be some problems with just citing older studies without really digging into them and going, do emotions necessarily follow cognition? There's some work that's frequently cited from the 1980s which suggests that. I think that's somewhat debatable. Sometimes also in this literature there are knowledge claims where the whole phenomenon is talked about, but really the study has a partial focus. So that's a trick to think about what really is being measured, and does that constitute the entirety of what we want to claim for the study. We also notice that hedges and uncertainties about the value of self-report are used repeatedly to argue for a shift to technical directions. That's a tactic that people use when things are a little uncertain to go, well, we need to do something new. That's one way of looking at it. We could also look at it and say we need to do what we're doing better rather than something new. So hedges and uncertainties, another linguistic device in the justification of studies which is used. And there's also an unstated moral position. This is not trivial. The many studies of emotions seem to implicitly be saying that tourism needs to be universally boosted, that emotions are a pathway to understanding satisfaction and therefore growing tourism. Well, I think that we need to also just take a step back and go, is that actually everything that we want to say about the role of emotions? Do we want to talk a little bit more about the ethics of tourism development and emotions' role in justifying and improving and, if you like, underpinning sustainability? So the moral position, I think, of many of the studies is just more tourism is better without really thinking that one through. And that's a kind of a hidden position in the text. And finally, I want to suggest that the linguistic devices also use the concept of what I'm going to call bypassing. They've missed some things. And in these missing elements, I think we have some gaps. Gaps which researchers, and perhaps many of the talented people in the room to whom I'm speaking or to whom I hope are listening eventually to this little chat, can contemplate and perhaps pursue. I've already suggested that the time issue in studying emotions can take us right through from anticipation to pre- and post-travel savouring, where we might contemplate emotions in a longer time frame than we currently seem to be interested in. And I know that most of you are gathered together in Vienna, or if you're reading your PowerPoint here or listening to this talk in another context, you perhaps need to think about the fact that nearly all the work on emotions that's in the existing published tourism literature, and most of it in the psychology literature as well, is Western-centric. And we do know from a number of studies that there are cross-cultural differences in the expression of emotions here, particularly the, if you like, weakening or attenuation of the public emotional expression, which is in some Asian communities. So thinking about that issue, there's some fascinating new developments for tourism study in that emotional array and, if you like, ceilings and floor effects from a cross-cultural world. I think it's fair to say that the human ethology research tradition, which has had something of resuscitation since the Human Ethology Bulletin Journal was published in 2012 or revitalised in 2012, seems to be missing from the tourism work. These are the people that have carefully analysed faces and body movements and so on about emotion. We don't see a lot of that, and so there's more to gain from looking at tourism study from that point of view. How emotions might shape sustainability actions, the particular triggers to sustainability in an emotional sense, which might contribute to our wider view of the purpose of emotion research has been mentioned briefly before. It's worth, I think, inserting it again as a gap. And finally, the big dynamic, which is a major theme in psychology, social psychology research, which is that our emotions are in fact often regulated by other people. We change, modify, shape the way we appear, what we say about our emotional experience due to the very presence of other people we care about. So that is missing in the tourism study. We've treated everybody as individuals. We haven't necessarily put them in the social context where their emotion matters. Now, the last and I think also significant level of looking at this field with discourse analysis is to consider research in context. And research in context reminds us that what we do is not always a straightforward product of academic drivers. Context matters. And social practice, which is the formal title for the third level of discourse, has to be understood through processes outside the text. So the comments that I'm going to make now were driven by some other sources of information. And using field theory, originally of course, devised by Lewin, and then some modern expression of that in some tourism work by Tribe and Liebert, really says pay attention to the forces surrounding individuals, pay attention to the non-academic drivers of the academic work. And so what we did here was I went on a bit of a travel mission and story and researched some colleagues and former friends and people I know in different parts of the world, and by looking at some of the leading ideas coming out of prestige places like Oxford and Harvard, and looking at what some of the senior members of the Australian Research Council and the Australian Business Deans Council said to me about doing research in this space, I can come up with a summary, a context summary, a social practice summary. Fundamentally, people said, to maximise your chances for grants, money, and university-wide respect, be as scientific as possible. In other words, go in the neuroscience direction. That's where the money is. That's where the status lies with your colleagues. And so I can conclude from that social practice sense, if that's what you want, if that's what drives you in the context you work in, then position yourself that way and do that kind of work. But don't, if you like, dismiss other paths. They exist too. The self-report work, the human ethology tradition, there's strong pathways as well, and while they might not bring in so much money or so much status or prestige, they're also very powerful ways, and from my own skin in the game context, I think they're quite insightful ways to produce work which is meaningful for managers and for other people. So let me align these points from the discourse analysis. What I want to say is the force fields in which we work may not always align with or foster the academic analysis of the only ways or the best ways to research a topic. No pathway, no methodology is so powerful as to reject others. And we do have opportunities here as tourism scholars, as people interested in emotions, to look at the full trajectory of time, the cross-cultural possibilities, the limited recognition of human ethology work, and the interactive regulatory power of other people on emotions. They're paths that are not yet taken, and I'd certainly like to participate with people and see research coming out in that direction. So in conclusion, returning to Lord Florey's question, what are we doing here? Can we add any insights to the emotions research? I hope I've provided a little bit of insight into the institutional and status pressures which are driving us in a certain direction as a force field, producing fairly positivist work in many cases, which may be very impressive to an elite, but maybe not capturing the breadth of the full phenomenon. And I've highlighted that if we want to do work that's ethical, reliable, credible, maybe a mixed agenda of styles to make a difference for multiple stakeholders in a just way is very worthwhile considering. I'm going to say that new possibilities exist, and I hope to have identified some of those. And this is no short story in tourism study. There's no immediate finish line here. So there's plenty of work to do. Just quickly, I want to acknowledge some of my PhD people and research team members who helped me collect that text and help me analyse some of the work. And for those of you that have a physical copy of this PowerPoint, there's some references used to prepare this presentation, specific work that I wanted to look at, and there's some work that I've done with my colleagues on the emotions topic. Thank you for your attention. I hope that the Vienna experience is a really good one for you. And I'm sorry I'm not there, but a few personal circumstances prevented me coming this time. Hope to see some of you in Europe, in Australia, in North America in the not too distant future. Thank you.